It wasn't all that long ago when the discussion between processors was pretty short. Intel versus AMD wasn't much of a discussion. If you wanted to have the best performance possible, you had one option. A lot has changed in the last 3 years. We're going to discuss that. So I want to make it very clear off the bat, this is mostly a talking head. I might sprinkle a little bit of B-roll in along the way, but I really just want to talk about this because this is something that's been going on for the last few years. And I want to pipe in my own opinion as a more casual user, as someone who is a little bit of an enthusiast, but not much. The AMD versus Intel discussion. It's really wild to me that about three and a half years ago, this wasn't a discussion. You had really one solid option. Now, FX people will come in and say they work just fine, and that's fine and dandy, but let's be really honest here. AMD really didn't do a very good job with its FX series, the Bulldozer, the entire lineup of processors in that family. Was it Excavator? All of those just really struggled. And there was a lot of hype behind them. This was, again, AMD coming out swinging and missing. And this was a thing that had been a problem since their Phenom days. The AMD Phenom was really their big last hurrah. At least it felt that way for a while. Intel then came out with the Core series of processors and just wiped the floor with them. Particularly once you got to the Sandy Bridge era with the 2500 and the 2600, Intel just stood head and shoulders above AMD in every regard. And let's not forget the high-end desktop space. There was no offerings from AMD there. It was Intel or nothing. X79, X99, all by themselves. And the same thing went for the server space. If you wanted a server-grade CPU, you had Xeons and that was it. But late in 2016, the rumors were really going wild. AMD was coming with its Zen architecture, and they were going to come out swinging. And a lot of people, including myself, kind of looked at this and said, we'll see what happens. You know, we've heard this story before. The truth of the matter is that nobody was really that impressed. AMD had sung this song and dance before. Its graphics card department had fallen well behind NVIDIA. There just wasn't a lot of expectations. But then Ryzen came out, and first gen Ryzen was surprisingly good. It wasn't beating the doors off of Intel, but it was better than what people expected. Now, there were early adopter issues. People did have problems with memory. The Infinity Fabric was very finicky, and there were definitely no shortages of early issues, but a few BIOS updates seemed to fix a lot of the problems that came out, and generally speaking, people had positive experiences. It couldn't compete with Intel in gaming performance, but the CPU performance gap was significant. And even more significant was AMD coming into the high-end desktop space, coming into the server space, introducing Threadripper, introducing Epic. I remember the scrambling that Intel had to do ahead of, I believe it was Computex in 2017, when Threadripper was announced, and Intel didn't have anything on its next generation of high-end desktop parts, X299. And the early signs were there that Intel was struggling with its production. X99 had been around for a few years, and Intel was now kind of just reiterating things with what was it? You had Skylake, and then they came out with Kaby Lake, which offered virtually zero improvement. Then you had Coffee Lake, and so on. AMD put Intel on its heels. AMD in 2017 said, you want 6 and 8 core processors at the mainstream level? True 6 and 8 core processors? We gotcha. Intel looked at it, Intel had been holding on to the quad core thing for years, saying that consumers didn't need more, or worse, implying that it couldn't be done. And then AMD went and did it. The 1700, the 1700X, the 1800X. They introduced affordable high-end desktop parts. There were Threadripper parts for $500. The highest core count Threadripper was at $1,000, and it quickly dropped in price, especially if you had a Micro Center nearby. And Epic didn't take off initially, as I think most businesses took a wait-and-see approach, but it's grown over the course of time. Now, by no means is Intel in trouble, but you could see that Intel wasn't ready for this. They had to get the 8700K out sooner than I think they meant to, which was Coffee Lake, because now it was clear consumers wanted 6-core processors. They then had to get 8-core out, so 9900K came out, but the 9900K came out and was impossible to find and was inflated to near $600 at points. Meanwhile, you could go get a 2700 for half that cost. It really became a big problem. Intel was caught on its heels. And frankly, they haven't gotten off their heels, which has led some to believe maybe they just don't care. They don't care about the build your own enthusiast level, because what is the high-end desktop segment been for the last few years? X299 came out and they continued to charge the same outlandish prices that they've been charging for years. And you couldn't find them even if you wanted them. Now, the 7980XE was reported to be fun. I watched Jay and Steve from Gamers Nexus just battle each other in benchmarking and overclocking. And there was definitely a fun factor there, but scarcity was becoming a problem. And you saw this with the 7000 series. You saw this with the 9000 series refresh. In fact, the theme for Intel has been refresh. How many times have you seen the 14 nanometer plus jokes? Meanwhile, AMD has been improving its architecture. First gen Ryzen was solid, but not spectacular. Zen Plus, the refresh, the 2000 series, which this is the 2600 box that I used in my niece's build, offered improvements. The IPC got better, CPU performance got better, gaming performance got better. But the real knockout punch seems to have been landed with 3000 series, second gen Ryzen, especially now that you're starting to see them get into the laptops and make their way into other portions of the marketplace. In particular, the 3600, which is this processor right here, is a knockout at $150 some, 6 cores, 12 threads. This thing gets a better score in Cinebench than my 8700K, which came out and was about $400 at launch, right? AMD has made up significant ground. Now, you could sit there and say that the 10600K will probably beat it, and you'd be right, but I don't have that processor, so I can't, speak on that. All I know is that my 8700K is still really good, but the 3600 beats it in CPU performance by the slimmest of margins, but it's still a win, and it's more than half the cost. This is where AMD is right now. And yeah, they're starting to kind of do the same fluff that Intel has done, the XT series of processors. Meanwhile, Intel is still struggling. Recent search on Micro Center's website for 10th gen parts netted some 10700s, a 10600, and I believe a 10400, and that was it. No 10900Ks, really hardly any K SKUs at all at my local Micro Center, but a ton of Ryzen processors. And these things are selling like crazy. They're not slowing down. There hasn't been some slowdown in sales, and that's why they're in stock. AMD's just doing better with its yields, and Intel is struggling, and we keep hearing this, and now they're restructuring again. The other thing you're hearing is the server space. They are making major moves there. Laptops, can they make up ground there? Now, this battle is far from won. AMD is still vastly far behind Intel in terms of overall profits. Intel is just significantly bigger, and Intel, as we've discussed amongst ourselves with friends, is more than just CPUs. They have heavily invested in other areas, and it's going to be interesting to see just how much they actually put into the build your own segment. The bottom line here is as great as this has sounded for AMD, they're still behind. That's a testament, one, to how great Intel had been for a number of years, how far behind AMD had fallen with its product stack, but also to the consumer mindset. I'm willing to bet if you're not a PC enthusiast, you don't even know AMD exists. You just look for the Intel inside. And this is particularly predominant with the system integrators, the SIs. So AMD still has a lot of work to do. They need to sell more laptops. They need to sell more pre-built systems. They just need to get into those markets better. Now, the 4000 series processors, which is a confusion all in itself since it's second gen, is a step in the right direction. It's something that they need to be able to do. These processors are just really good. These mobile CPUs are good, but they've got to be put into good laptops. And so far, the early responses have not been great. The laptops aren't that good. So AMD still has a lot of ground to make up. Now, a lot of people are waiting for Intel to come with the kill shot. It has felt like it's only a matter of time. And I've seen a lot of people say it may not be till 2021, maybe 2022 before you really see Intel come with something that absolutely is great. And I hope that's not the case. It's going to be really interesting though. AMD is still prepping 3rd gen Ryzen for later this year. And there are rumors coming out that these processors are going to be even better. AMD has increased its IPC. They've increased their performance in games. If you look at gaming charts from some of the reviewers and you see where the 1000 series versus the 2000 series versus the 3000 series, you can see that they go up. It's a remarkable thing, and they need to continue to improve that. But what is Intel still doing that keeps people coming back? Well, there's a couple of things, and Linus touched on this in his video. For me personally, there's a little bit more of a fun factor, partially because I'm not quite familiar with AMD and its overclocking and all that stuff. But there's more of a fun factor. There's something to be said about taking a processor like my 5820K and taking it from its base clock of 3.6 gigahertz and overclocking it all core to 4.4 gigahertz. My 8700K going to 5 gigahertz, which it can hit 5.1 if I really push the voltage. But the 2600 that I played with couldn't get past 4.1. I don't know about this 3600, and I don't know that there's a benefit to going beyond it because I haven't had a chance to play around with it much. I'm going to find out. I want to see if I overclock it, does the performance improve or not? That's the fun thing about Intel. You can artificially gain performance with overclocking. And you can't necessarily do that with AMD because of how their processors work. Now, the XT seems to have a hit or miss when it comes to overclocking. Steve from Gamers Nexus mentioned his 3600 XT was an excellent overclocker, but his 3900 wasn't. But I've also seen someone who had a 3900 XT that was a really good overclocker, got to 4.5 gigahertz. That's pretty good for AMD. Now, if AMD can continue to improve that, if it becomes more fun to overclock an AMD processor, that starts to shift the story. But for me, there's just a fun factor with Intel that isn't there with AMD. It's just more fun to go into the BIOS and tweak a few settings and see what just did you get. You have more headroom with Intel than you do with AMD. But maybe that's just a testament to how good the AMD processors are out of the box. But for overclockers, it's less fun. What do I think is going to happen though over the next couple of years? I think Intel's going to come with something. If they can get off of 14 nanometer, if they can get to 10 or 7 nanometer, I'm fairly confident they'll come with something that will be really good. But we've got to see that happen. They haven't been able to get they haven't even been able to get 10 nanometer out of the door, while AMD is talking about shrinking to 5 nanometer. Now, I get what AMD does is the little chiplets that are, the 7 nanometer chiplets that are 8 core, especially on the high core count CPUs, the 12 core and the 16 core. But think about that for a second. 12, 16 core processors on the mainstream level. A reminder that about 3.5 years ago, you had to pay a steep premium to get 8 core, a steeper premium to get 10 core. Now you can go to Micro Center and get a 12 core CPU for $400. It's insane to think about. It's really not surprising though. The rise in game streaming, the content creation, software that actually utilizes multi-core performance, the rise in these things has made it so that the more cores, the better. That's why you're seeing Threadripper go from, starting at an 8 core like it did with the the 1900X, to now the entry level Threadripper is the 24 core monster. 24 cores, 32 cores, 64 cores. There's an insane amount of stuff that AMD is doing. And here's the wild part. They don't have really any competition in the high-end desktop part. You can't find Intel parts. And Intel has been bizarrely, oddly quiet to me about anything coming in that pipeline. Which brings me to what I would actually personally like to see going forward. The competition is great. but I need to see some pushback from Intel. I need to see them come back with something that challenges AMD, because otherwise we're just going to have the same situation in a different hand. We're going to have AMD not have anybody sitting there, threatening them, and are they going to sit on their laurels? Are they going to start just, incrementally decreasing the improvement? I also want to see other things in the mainstream area. The cores are great, don't get me wrong, but there's a point of diminishing returns, particularly if you're a streamer, if you're a content creator, if you just play games. The cores they're not really going to do it for anybody. But as someone who does dabble in streaming, has dabbled in a number of different content creation things, one thing I would love to see is more PCI lanes on the mainstream parts. The bottom line is that at this point in time, 24 just isn't enough. I would love to see a minimum of 32. I would love to be able to take a mainstream processor in a build and be able to put 2 capture cards in there and not worry about suffocating my lanes, because that's what happens right now, especially with the rise in popularity of DSLRs and mirrorless cameras as webcams. They're just simply better for it. But you need either a cam link or, another generic, the cant links as they're called, or you need an internal capture card. And if you have an internal capture card for your camera, now what are you going to plug your console into if you do console gameplay? So I would love to see more PCI Express lanes, especially with M.2s becoming more popular, capture cards, and all the other PCI Express devices that are out there. Give us some more lanes. I don't know how difficult that is. I don't know enough about CPU architecture, but man, that would be really great to see 32 lanes or so on a mainstream part. That would really, really be great. And better offerings from Intel. At some point, Intel's got to realize you can't keep charging $500 for something that your competitor is charging $300 for. Intel continues to be popular though, and I think it's for the reasons I laid out earlier. They're just a little bit more fun to work with. And I think most people are familiar, especially overclockers, they're familiar with how Intel does it and the Intel boards. But I think that's going to do it for this. Let me know what you think. AMD, Intel, who's really doing really well? Is Intel in as much trouble as some people have implied? What do you think is going to happen? Let me know down in the comments below, and I'll see you in the next video.